So, um, so Deng Xiaoping,
Yeah,
can someone talk about him, his life, his trajectory to become the leader of the China?
yeah, he wasn't really like he didn't start off in like the richest family or anything like that. Kind of just like I mean, he kind of like made his own way in some sorts. Like it wasn't really like he had the money starting off a family, anything like that.
Right.
And that's
So,
I guess that's kind of how like he had more of a he was more sympathetic to those who were like living in communes. I guess
well, I think
maybe.
like I think what you're onto something is that he had, like you said, he grew up. He was like from a peasant family, a good student. So he earned a scholarship to study in France. So,
Right.
in the 1920s, a lot of Chinese students were sent abroad to learn. Um, and he worked, and he was one of the early members of the Communist Party. So he had really strong revolutionary credentials. So he was always like he was definitely from a young age involved in labor activism, and then he was a um, so yeah, he was like you were saying, he had sympathy for the people, um, and but like okay, so let's move up to like 1940s. He was in Yan'an, the communist base. Um, Someone wanted to talk. What is that noise? Is that all right? Um, he was he was more of a moderate. Okay, my point is like Deng Xiaoping was yeah.
I was raising my hand.
Oh, go ahead then. Who else wanted to talk?
Oh, me, Matthew.
All right, Matthew, go ahead.
All right. So as far as I know, he tried to stay neutral when it comes to politics, and
Hmm.
when like he was coming up with Mao, he kind of like viewed him as a cult leader, and he didn't really like that. And so because he put him in a position of like being neutral, and he was like over the military, like he low key became the leader when Mao went away.
Right. So he was like he was always involved during the 1950s. He was punished though. Like he became one of those officials who was persecuted by Mao during the Cultural Revolution because he advocated a more moderate approach. Like after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, he was more practical, more moderate. So Mao struggled, like basically had him sent to a labor camp during the Cultural Revolution. But he has like a strong base of support anyway. And when Mao dies, there's like a power struggle. Who will become the new leader? What direction will China go after the excesses and the radicalism of the last decade? So Mao had actually appointed this guy named Hua Guofeng to be his leader, and Hua Guofeng, I don't really know much about him, but he didn't have a huge party. He was not very high up. He didn't have a huge base of support, and gradually he doesn't assert power, and Deng Xiaoping becomes. I guess they have like a party meeting where they determine who's going to be the next leader, and Deng Xiaoping becomes the next leader. And I think what you were saying was he doesn't want to be like Mao. He doesn't want to have a cult following. He wants to be more like just practical and rule by reason, have experts help determine the policies, and not just have this sort of fanatical faith in the masses that could do anything. So kind of making China more modernizing China based on science and economic ideas. And he had this famous saying, right? It doesn't matter if the mouse is it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse, right? So it doesn't matter if it's communist or capitalist as long as the Chinese economy can grow and people can have good lives. So he's credited a lot with like opening up China and making China prosperous. Um, he visited the United States. He went on this tour of the United States in like the 19 I and he everyone in America loved it because he was like this. he was open to America. He was the opposite of Mao. Like he wore a cowboy hat. He did like a tour of Texas, and he was like, singing songs, English songs. So this was supposed to be like, opening a new era, which I guess it did open a new era. Um, so Timothy, does someone else want to say something? Talking about Deng Xiaoping, the leader after Mao.
No, I forgot I
Yeah.
had my hand raised. You guys are like pretty much said everything.
Yeah, I didn't want to. Yeah, I shouldn't talk so much. I just want to make sure I get my points across. So, all right. Well, let's. So why does Wei Jingsheng? What does he say? That he's like this dissident, right? What is? Did anyone read that the essay that he wrote about the fifth modernization? Anyone have a chance to read it or skim through it yet? All right, Matthew.
He wanted democracy to be the fifth, I guess, pillar of advancement. I don't know what to call it,
Yeah,
but it led to the Tiananmen massacre.
Okay. So, all right. So just to clarify chronologically, he writes that essay in 1979. So this is just at the beginning of the reform period when Deng Xiaoping opens up when Deng Xiaoping is talking about the promise of modernization and giving, opening the economy and, modernizing the whole country. So Wei Chengsheng says that's not enough, right? Um, the Tiananmen Square massacre actually occurs much later. That's a decade later, and I mean, but certainly you could say that Wei Jingsheng's essay was partly, definitely inspired people and got people thinking about, a political change. But he wasn't. There was no massacre at that time. The democracy wall movement of 1979, it just sort of petered out slowly. The government didn't have to come in with tanks. That happened during the later movement. Um, but Wei Jingsheng is very critical, right, of communism. Why is he so critical of it? What does he say about communism, or at least about China, the Communist Party in China? Anyone have any thoughts about like what he's saying in that essay? Like anyone? Was that Matthew?
Hello? No,
No,
this is Tim. I just want to say,
Go ahead, Tim. Yeah.
I want to say which one was wasted. Like, I remember reading all the articles, but like, I forget.
Okay.
I get the names mixed up at this point. Like, was this the long one? Was this the 2-page one?
No, Wei Jingsheng was the
Or,
democracy essay about democracy.
well, I mean, I think basically he talked about how Deng Xiaoping was a little bit more free, like not free to the point where they were allowing some forms of capitalism, but he thought that communism wouldn't work. Like this is the fifth reformation or something they called it. But
Yeah, like,
I can't. It's really hard to keep up with names, so because
yeah.
there's a lot of
Well,
stories.
he was basically just really anti communist party, the way the communists had ruled over the since 30, basically they had been in power for 30 years, right, since 1949. And his point in that essay is that under communism the people are supposed to be the masters, right? It's the proletariat. You're supposed to the people who produce things are supposed to be determining how that production is allocated and gaining the fruits of their production, right? But because of the Communist Party, they had no power. Like the actual people had no say in anything, and they were heavily, it wasn't. It was just basically a dictatorship, right? So he's saying um, under communism, there was no democracy, like there was no freedom. And he talks a lot about freedom and happiness at the end of the essay as like, people's kind of like from almost like a Western liberal perspective, like this is the ultimate aim. And only democracy can guarantee people having freedom. Under communism, you have this one party dictatorship, and no matter how the economy, even if the economy is improving, like what he talks about under Deng Xiaoping, he says, so even if there is more money out there, it's not necessarily going to go to the people, right? Because it's a dictatorship, and the government will do whatever they want with the surplus, right? And they just will tax us more. So he's like kind of very insightful about, you know, the relationship between politics, economics, that regardless of the new economic or some reforms, that's not enough, is what he's saying, right? And also just how people Mao, you know, he's basically, if you read that essay, how he compares Mao to like Stalin and Hitler in some ways. Like they're just basically despots who don't really care. They use the word of like the masses. They talk about the masses. Everything is for the masses, but in reality, they have no concern, and they don't. They just oppress anyone who is against, who dares to have any dissent from the Communist Party. You lose your freedom, right? So he is very bold to do that, and he ends up going to jail, right? He gets a jail sentence, a 13-year jail sentence for promoting those ideas. So again, the Communist Party very quickly shuts this idea of democracy down. They don't want people to talk about it or at least talk about it in such brutally honest and like critical ways. So he risked his freedom for that, and he wrote more while he was in jail. There's a whole book about him. If you're interested in doing any research about Wei Jingsheng, you can find translations of his essays. So, all right. Someone else? Did Matthew? Someone else have a comment? Austin? Someone has their hand up?
I was wondering, back then, do you think China was ready to move to a democratic government?
Well, I mean, you know, I'm not. That's not my role. Like, I don't know. I mean, that's a very big question. I think based on the popular sentiments of the people, by the end of the 1980s, there was a lot of support for at least dialogue with the high level, the what the government, with the student leaders and the workers who joined in that large Tiananmen Square movement for democracy. They just wanted basically dialogue. They wanted to have their ideas heard. Whether or not that would have created a new system, whether the Communist Party would have said, okay, we're going to agree to have a complete multi-party democracy, that's probably not likely, but I guess that's what the students were suggesting. But they basically wanted also just to get their ideas out and to express their frustrations about like corruption, nepotism in the party. Also, a lot of economic inflation was happening at this point. So even though you had this reform period where people were gaining more money, you also had things were costing more money, and people weren't able to keep up with the rising cost of living, especially if you were like a farmer. I mean, there was always a huge gap between like urban living and country rural living in China, and that was exacerbated during the reform period. The country still didn't invest heavily in the countryside, so farmers could maybe make more money selling things, but then they had to pay more taxes. The government taxed them heavily. Things like schooling became you didn't have like free schools anymore. You had to pay for tuition for schools. So it just became almost like a lot of frustrations people were experiencing, even though they had more, you know, certain degree of economic power. They didn't feel like it was being spread out very evenly, and a lot of corruption was going on. So people who were like party elites would get contracts, would actually start companies. They would take these big state-owned enterprises and privatize them. And if you were like a party elite high up, you had more access to like being, you know, a manager or an owner of these companies. So that people caught on to that very quickly. So in terms of your question, that's a big question. I mean, I think what Wei Jingsheng is saying in his essay is that this whole idea that the Chinese can't have democracy is a bunch of crap. His idea was, you know, some people will say, oh, China, you know, is not ever going to have, cannot have a democracy. It needs a strong emperor, a strong leader. And he basically gives reasons why that's just not true. That Chinese people didn't, deserve better than that. But, it's an interesting question that you raised, because a lot of people have gone, a lot of people who just became wealthy or, middle class enjoyed the fruits of the reforms, and enjoyed the fruits of China's economic rise. A lot of them have, been silent, or they have not chosen to demand any political reform. So there's sort of this silent majority almost, where people have accepted the government, the Communist Party's like basic premise is that it's no longer like ideological, like, okay, you have to follow us because communism is the best way, and that's a fact, and anyone else is a bad. They don't talk about ideology so much anymore, although it's coming back under the current leader. But they talk about nationalism and economic, wealth. Basically, as long as we can show that we are producing economic benefits for the people, and as long as we are a strong nation that can stand up to other countries, then that's our legitimacy, is based on those two things: nationalism and financial, power. So political reform has been sort of swept aside. I mean, it's not, I shouldn't say swept aside completely, because you still have protests almost every day in China. Like, they don't get reported. Small scale protests about, land being taken by the government, or, corruption, or any, small scale things. But as long as they don't become like nationwide protests, you don't hear about them. So anyway, to talk about the stories that we read for this week, the village, the first one, which was on a village market street, and I assigned that because it shows you a little bit about the changes that started happening in rural areas, right, in the early years of the reform era. Did anyone have a chance to read that yet? And if so, please discuss that story. Matthew? The village, on a village market street, about the farmers who stand up to the strong villager. Okay, Tim, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, that was the one with the old man, right? Uncle Fung or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, Uncle Fung. Hmm.
Oh, yeah, so it was just like a little short narrative about this drunkard guy who witnessed like two families getting into an argument, two women. One of the women like had ties to the Communist Party in the town, and the other
Right,
one was like less well. So basically, he testified against the woman who had ties in the party. The
right.
Communist Party could have retaliated against him, given him less food and stuff, but because of the new change of times and because of the new freedom afforded to him through capitalism, he was able to speak out against the crime and basically say that she did it. And it was really just an empowering thing for him. Like, it was an empowering narrative.
Summary. Yeah, the only small. That's right. I mean, overall, I think you put it really well. The thing was, the two women were like accusing. One woman accused the poorer or less powerful woman, um, had accused, or someone had accused the son of the wealthy, powerful woman of stealing something from her son, right? The poor son. And so the secretary asks Uncle Fung, he said, Uncle Fung, you were there on the street, you saw what happened. Did this boy retaliate and beat up? Did he like hurt this other kid? And so Uncle Fung says, no. What happened was, the kid of this Law, Mrs. Law, who is the wife of the communist, official, the accountant, um, her son had basically just stolen something, like a kid, took something from this other kid, and whatever the details. that he gets hit, someone, that as a result, someone hits him, like someone else basically hit the kid or did something to upset him. So the mother accuses the other boy of hitting her son. So Uncle Feng says, I was there, and the boy whose things were taken, he didn't do anything. He just, he shouldn't be bothered. But your larger point was correct, absolutely. That because of the reform and Uncle Feng now has able to make money, he doesn't have to beg for food from the husband. He's able to feel more what's the word, um, independent. And yeah, so there's sort of a sense of, I guess, optimism to the story that, wow, people are doing better now. People are raising their own crops, and they have incentive, and they're motivated, and they're no longer going to be drinking because they have so much work to do to benefit, right? So that was the point of that story, and it shows you, again, that's like a small village, right? Just typical village in China, where the power dynamics are changing, right? And the communist government is no longer like totally in command of the economy, right? People have some command. What about the other story? Anyone want to talk about the accident? Did anyone have a chance to read that one?
Yeah, I read over that one.
Okay, Drew, can you summarize that story?
So it was basically about a lawyer and a vegetable farmer who had gotten in a car crash,
Right.
and um, it basically was like, so the vegetable farmer, like the lawyer, like confronted him about it because he wasn't trying to get in trouble. And he was like asking the vegetable farmer for his driver's license, but he didn't have one. And I
Right.
think he called like the commissioner of the police precinct and
Yeah.
help him get out of trouble. And so
Yeah.
when police showed up, they were giving the vegetable farmer like a lot harder, like a much harder time. So
Right.
they took the guy took all his money, or the police took all his money and gave it to the lawyer for the damages that he caused to his car. And
Right.
on top of that, wasn't it like the lawyer was driving drunk too?
Yeah, I think right. I think the driver was responsible for hitting this, or
Because he was saying something about he didn't have his lights on, so that probably was like part of him like driving drunk.
yeah,
What
yeah,
caused
yeah, right. He was at fault, and
Yeah,
um and this poor peddler, this peasant who was basically riding the bike, had his produce on his bicycle, taking it to town, whatever, or whatever he was doing with it. He gets he falls, he gets into a bike, he crashes into the car, and so instead of like taking responsibility, he realizes he has connections in the police, and that his connections can handle it, right? So this is, like you were saying, it's an example of corruption, right? Like that this is just what's happening now, but people are relying on connections within the political establishment, police. They're all connected, right? So
and I think
um,
it also just shows how like little the lower class has advanced like through modernization, like to still be able to like just get shit on like in this
yeah,
manner.
yeah. I mean, it's true. It's really like a very direct like um, indication of how like the sort of status of the average person, if they don't have people who can take care of them in government usually, or
Right.
you know basically there's always going to be also bribery, like you can always, in China it's typical, like if something happens you can kind of pay your way, if you have the money you can pay your way out of trouble. And so he just called up, like you said, I guess was it
He
another
called up,
lawyer?
like he was like the commissar, I think is what they
Yeah,
said.
someone high up in the police, and he makes sure that the guy who is like investigating on the site, right? He tells the policeman on site to don't get the lawyer in trouble, right? Like just take care of it. Um, And so what I think was really disturbing about that is the end where he tries to get every penny he can, right?
Takes all of his money.
He takes all of his money, and so it's just like again this classist this system where the people are if you don't have education, power, money, you look you can be easily taken advantage of, and that's why so it's sort of like a microcosm of the general society. Like people in China, um, the government can come and basically do whatever they want with your land. They can take it from you and sell it to developer. Um, you don't have a lot of um, options. You don't have. I mean, the judicial system isn't so transparent and it's not independent. Like basically, the judicial system works for the government in some ways. It's not totally independent. That's why they have this tradition of petitioners going to China, to Beijing. Like if you have not been happy, if you haven't received like appropriate compensation, or you feel like the local judge has you know wronged you, people go up to there's like actually an office for people to go to in Beijing where you petition, and that's like kind of the one you know it's almost like people it takes a lot of effort to go there and do that, but it's sort of still there is some form of democracy, I guess, or some form of what's the word I'm looking for, like you know redress, but it's definitely, yeah. So all of these things are like happening, this change is happening, but people there's some good things happening, right? Peasants are having more power in some ways financially, but not all of them. And then there's a lot of corruption going on in China still. So um did someone else have a Timothy, or I see your
I
hand?
have a question.
Uh-huh.
So is this
You,
like an autobiography? Like, did this really happen, or was this just like somebody just making something up?
you know what? I think it's based on something that probably happened, because this the author Murong, that's his pen name, Murong Xuecun. I think I was reading about him. I have to go back. I think he was a journalist for many years before he became a writer. So this is definitely like something that would have happened. I don't know if it's like true, like exactly the details, but this stuff happens pretty often. Um, and yeah, so you could, like, if you're interested in doing research on this author and his his stories, that would be a good topic as well. Um, so I tried to keep it short this week. I did want to give you that democracy essay just because I think it's very important in terms of like moving ahead as we look at like the Tiananmen Square massacre and the the movement for democracy and at the end of the decade, to see that you know there has been this push. There have been voices throughout the People's Republic that have challenged the monopoly of power of the communist regime, and just how brave you have to be to do that in a totalitarian, system. You're basically paying with your freedom if you voice voice your ideas. Um, oh, so we do 2 articles a week. 3 is so much. Okay, we can't even have a focused discussion. Okay. I will consider this. All right. Okay. Sure. All right. So, um, well, let's do this then. For Thursday, I'm going to give you like a 12-page essay to read. Austin, did you have something to say?
Oh yes, I was thinking about the previous article and
Mm-hmm.
about the relationship between like face culture,
Uh-huh.
because it seemed like the guy, the lawyer who was drunk, when the
Right.
people started to get near him, he
Uh-huh.
wanted to save face. So I guess that's why he treated the other person poorly, I guess it looked
Right.
like.
Oh, so talking about just as a cultural thing, like how
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't want to take responsibility because first, yeah, he would obviously lose face, like you're saying, but he would also probably have to pay for the damages of the bicycle, right? Or whatever. Um, or he would have to pay for the damage to his car. So he was very just selfish about it. Um, okay. So, did someone else have a comment? Matthew? No? I see your
Um,
hand is up.
oh, I had a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
I was about to talk about the short story, the accident.
Uh-huh.
So piggybacking off what Austin was saying, like he really didn't want to get in trouble. Like even when the man started to come to his senses again, he started
Right.
doing. And even in the beginning, he was using a lot of like he was trying to like use power, kind of in a sense to like submit him, so
Right.
that like oh give me your driver's license, give me that, and it kind of highlights the oppression of the lower class citizens. And also, what else was I was about to say something else too. Um, oh yeah, I realized how he said the damages would be like at least 100 yuan, but the cop literally took all the money he had, like it was 330 yuan or something like that. And you could tell that the man didn't have that much because when the lawyer left, he could see that the man was just sitting in the street by himself, like at a park or something like that. He just looked like, he just been through hell.
Right.
So I don't know. That just kind of stuck out to me a little bit how they took more money than they needed to. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end, was it the guy himself who got the driver, the lawyer, he at the end took even more money from him, right?
yeah, and he was in the wrong the whole time. He even told the policeman like, "Oh yeah, thank you, man. I'll take you to dinner." Like, you know,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
a whole conspiracy going on in that city. So
Right. Yeah. I think that sort of shows you a lot about just how justice doesn't work in the system. You don't have, I mean, who are you going to go to? I guess the farmer was so traumatized, I guess, or just intimidated also, right?
he was still bleeding the whole time.
Yeah, but he was like intimidated by the police more than hoping that they would help him,
Yeah,
you know? Um, so, so yeah, so this, that was like a very short, short story. Doesn't, um, I guess it was a little bit later. I think he wrote that in the last decade or so. So this could have taken place, anytime really, in the last decade or 2 decades in China. Um, whereas the earlier one, the Market Street story was really, well, that was set again in 19 late 1970s and early 80 when the peasants were just starting to um, make a little more money and have a little more financial power. Um, and um, so I understand where you're coming from. Yeah. So I will definitely try to keep it. The readings. I guess I was thinking like 35 total pages. That was like in the ballpark, but I think maybe because there were four separate. Um, yeah. I
Yeah,
understand.
that was because if it was just one or two, like the old style, that's much better. Like for me, it was just the variety. Like every single one was a different story.
Right.
Like it was like trying to read three books at the same time. You can't possibly focus on one of them. Like,
I know. I was being too ambitious there. All right. All right. So for yeah, yep. Um I agree. I agree with you there. So so if you were to like summarize just a little bit about this period then, um I think going back to what we said at the beginning of the class about Deng Xiaoping, um, what are some of the good things and bad, like pluses and negatives then?
I'd say one plus is just that it seemed like during this period, especially like with the people now wanting to incorporate democracy within their society, it seems like now they're starting to get more of a voice and they're starting to become more confident because it just seemed more as like a group effort. I feel like,
Okay, so you
yeah,
mean like based on the essay by the activist?
yeah, based on the essay about the activists and he's like detailing all these people like getting together at the Democracy Wall.
Right.
And even then, like when people were at Tiananmen Square and we were reading about that and how a bunch of university students were there and it just seemed like a party type of environment. Everybody was crying for democracy and
Hmm.
all that type of stuff. So it just seems like the Chinese people were starting to develop that confidence and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Like after Mao dies, you would never. People were basically obsessed with Mao Zedong, right, and communism and the leader and Mao Zedong thought, and then that that ends pretty abruptly, and then people are beginning to look at other models for political reform, and so democracy, the thirst for democracy and freedom grows and grows and grows throughout the 1980s. I think partly because people also start having more economic freedom, and that was the argument that a lot of like people, political scientists, historians were making and predicting all these years, and it's not has not come to pass. Is that because of China's growing economic power and the people have more freedom to go out throughout the world, to travel, to buy things, they're ultimately going to want to have more political freedom too, to determine, have more power over what happens in their country. They thought that that would go hand in hand. That like you can't open up one way, you can't open up an economy and then keep the political system closed. But that hasn't happened, right? In China, you still have a communist one-party system. So they've been very good about bolstering their legitimacy through, like I said, nationalism and just appealing to people's sense of, well, you have it pretty good now. So if we change the system, it's going to be chaotic. And it's just propaganda still, right? There's a lot of propaganda still that happens. But I think that's a good point. So the people starting to have more press for freedom, democracy. Anything else? Positive or negative? Go ahead, Timothy.
I want to take a little bit of time to talk about Tiananmen. I don't know if we talked about it a lot already, but just in the first article, I think it was, or whichever one was the long one,
Right,
they talked about how the students had grievances and stuff they wanted to present to Deng Xiaoping, and I
right.
felt like because he was liberal, because he was a little bit more, progressive in his changes, they thought that they could get away with these types of protests and stuff. So, do you think that Deng Xiaoping's leadership style was more relaxed or like less radical than Mao Zedong's, or do you think that he just wasn't as respected?
No, I mean, I think it's
Because
a good. I think so Deng was more practical. He was more pragmatic. He was not ideologically obsessed with like communism. Um, he didn't have, there were no like, you never saw his poster all over the place. Like Mao Zedong, he had his poster everywhere. People had to study his writings. Deng Xiaoping purposefully kind of like dis- distanced himself from that kind of cult following. And I think he was respected because of that. I think people, rather than viewing him as less strong, people respected that he was more reasonable, and not so obsessed with like propaganda. Um, he also like assigned other people top positions in government. He didn't control everything. Like he was only the head of the military. Although he was, people knew that he was actually ultimately the number one controlling person. He allowed other people, other voices in the government. So you had a lot of moderates in power in his time. Um, he was also a victim of Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution, so he knew what it was like to be politically persecuted. So he didn't go after people for being, have different views. He supposedly like welcomed them. But to answer the question, I think was, um, did the students think that he would listen to them? Is that what you were asking?
It was like my comparison to Mao's leadership was
Yeah.
like he would never, like what Matthew was saying, he definitely regrets it because like Mao would never even let it get to that point. Like they would never even think that they have a voice. But the fact
Right.
that now they thought they could, have an influence and impact in the movement.
Right. But I think Chinese society had changed so much in that time. Like people, it was already opening up so much. Like people were traveling abroad, and students started going to the U.S. and Europe, Australia to study. They welcomed there was so much money coming from abroad, like foreign investment. During Mao's time, like China was cut off. There was no international. They had no allies. Like they were totally self-sufficient, right? They even cut themselves off from the Soviets. So Deng Xiaoping like opens China up, and China goes out to the world. The world comes back to China. He could not go back to that kind of leadership style, right? Of closed off, sort of cultish like leadership of Mao. But so people, um, there were a couple of reformers who were very powerful at that point. One of them was named Hu Yaobang, and another one was named Zhao Ziyang. And actually, the Tiananmen Square protest started because when Hu Yaobang died, Hu Yaobang was like a leader. Uh, he was one of the Politburo members, and he always took this. He was actually more on the student side. When they started, well, let's see, he died in April. So what happened was during his funeral, like in China, it's very common when like a leader dies, people come out and they mourn him publicly as a way of not just mourning the leader himself, but mourning like what he stood for. It's almost like a political act. Like you're saying, you know what, we uh, we stand in unison with this person because of his ideals, and we will continue to fight for his ideals. So he was one leader that they really liked because Hu Yaobang was moderate and he was pro-democracy in some ways. And then Zhao Ziyang was another leader who is negotiating with the students at the time of the Tiananmen Square um, movement, when people starting to live on, so they occupied the square for a few weeks and they had a hunger strike. And at this point, you have a power struggle behind the scenes between this guy named Zhao Ziyang, who is a reformer, and then Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng. Li Peng is like this hardliner, and um, ultimately, like the hardliners had their way, and they didn't want to negotiate anymore with the students. They felt like the students were being arrogant and like too demanding, and that why do they want so much? Like maybe if the students had said something like, we want these changes. We don't want to change. We don't want to overthrow the communist government, but we want reform. That might have been a little easier for them to handle, but they probably felt very scared for their own power, right? That wow, they're advocating like a whole new government system, and they weren't really ready to accept that. Um, they weren't even really ready to talk about that. So Deng Xiaoping becomes like a villain um, internationally. He is condemned for that massacre, for ordering the PLA, the People's Liberation Army troops to come in, you know, and basically brutalize the people, shooting people and just running over people. And so there were like, you know, several thousand people who died that night, a couple thousand, I don't know the exact number, but so up until that point, Deng Xiaoping was really lauded. He was celebrated as someone who was this great reformer, right? He had opened up China. He was welcoming foreigners to come to China to do business. He was, you know, creating this middle class, and there was, you know, it seemed to be more freedom for people, despite the fact that there was corruption, there was inflation, there were all these other problems, but overall things were looking good. Um, and then you had Tiananmen Square and the massacre. So his legacy is obviously very complicated, but because of cracking down so, you know, violently, he'll always be remembered as another dictator in some ways, right?
It's sad though, because his trajectory was going just, it was so progressive, and then it just did a completely 180 shift, or at least like people have to take a step back and think about like, oh, maybe he's just like Mao, and that kind of just hurt him, and it's
Yeah,
sad
it
because he
did.
really did do a lot for him.
I mean, I think he wanted, you know, he was a revolutionary all of his life. Like he was, you know, a communist, whatever. He had all the revolutionary credentials. He was, um, you know, he suffered himself under Mao. He was, but when push comes to shove, he had to make a decision, and he took responsibility. And he's, you know, what they did was they twisted they twisted the whole story, right? And they said the students were like, you know, bad, and you know the students were anti-government, and as a result of that, you had a real chill, right? And freedom, like freedom of speech. People didn't dare to like talk about that, or it really put like a chill, a damper on any kind of movement for political change. I think, you know, it's true. Like the government, he did a, like you said, very. I think that's, like you said, a 180. He changed. Um, but in retrospect, if you would look at what, you know, the challenge he faced, um, some people suggest that the students also should have been a little bit more disciplined, or should have had maybe thought out their strategy a little bit before like being so, you know, confrontational. That in some ways, people who defend Deng Xiaoping will say, you know, it wasn't something that he really wanted to do, but the students, in other words, he shouldn't take full blame. Like the students also should take some responsibility for the way they presented their demands. That there wasn't, it wasn't even democratic, you know, amongst themselves. There was infighting. The student leaders were like fighting over power themselves. You know, we look at the student movement as just this heroic movement, which in many ways it was, right? But that they had their own problems. And some of the student leaders also were out for like their own glory, and they just wanted like, they wanted to show how important they were. Some student leaders were criticized because they basically were saying like, yeah, we know that there has to be bloodshed. Like we want bloodshed because only then will, you know, people see how evil China in the government is. So, you know, basically, instead of saying, you know what, we've made our point, we pushed a little bit, maybe we could keep pushing, let's go back, let's, you know, people, let them go home, tell the students to go back to their schools. But they encouraged them to stay, and in some ways sacrifice their lives. So there's a lot of debate about whether was that the right thing to do. You know, you could have saved people's lives if you just, you know, step back a little bit. And again, I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying these are the ideas that have been like talked about. It's not at all to justify the use of the army like that. But this is a totalitarian government, right? So in some ways, it's not surprising that that happened. Um, But so for like, did Austin you have a question or a comment?
I was wondering, did the protesters, were they given any warning that the military will intervene?
Right,
And
that's a good
if
question.
they did?
Um, you know, I think as that night approached, or as that June 4th approached, there had been a lot of tension growing, and I think they were warned to clear out of the square. I'm not sure how much time they were given. I think they weren't given a whole lot of time, and that there was a lot of confusion. It seems like before people knew what was happening, the army was already like occupying Beijing. So the army had already come into Beijing for weeks. They were already there. Like they had been called up for weeks. But the people of Beijing were very sympathetic to the students, and they actually would form these like barriers to the army tanks and stop them. And you know, they would give them food and say, you know what, you should be on the side of the people. Like, don't you understand that this is a people's movement? The army is supposed to support the people, not oppress the people. So a lot of some army, like some of the people in the army, actually, like I think, abandoned their positions, or they just didn't. They didn't like arrest people. They were pretty calm until that night. Um, and that night was very brutal. The tanks came in, and you would be crushed. Like if you were in the way, they just crushed you. And they shot, you know, indiscriminately. A lot of people died. They weren't even on the square. They were like people in the streets or people rushing to go home, trying to get away. So it was just kind of like this, you know, carnage. Um, and so for a few years, like China became a pariah internationally. Um, a lot of businesses, you know, took their money out of China. They brought their, you know, companies home or whatever. But and then there was this talk about, you know, in the U.S. Um, promoting human rights in China. So like making human rights improvements a condition for free trade agreements, right? For letting China into the World Trade Organization. So a lot of Western governments are saying, you know, until China improves its human rights record, there's no way it can become part of the world community. But you know, that sort of shifted. People started talking more about, you know, how we need to include China in the world no matter what, yada yada yada. You know, they're still working on their human rights issues, but shouldn't be so harsh on them. Um, so what happened was in 1992, Deng Xiaoping went on this tour of China, the southern tour, and he goes to like the factory areas, the special economic zones, and he basically like reaffirms the idea of keeping China open. So I think a lot of foreigners, Westerners, thought that China would close out again, maybe become more closed. But he basically affirms China's commitment to being open economically and, you know, continuing to reform in some ways. And so that's why China's economy kept growing, because people came back and did business in China. So it was like, you know, it was like a blip, and I guess you could say a little bit of a blip on China's ascension, or, you know, rise economically. It didn't have, in the end, it didn't have a huge impact on China's growth. Um, it didn't have a huge impact on the West's view of China, really, um, in the sense that they didn't keep pushing China. They didn't keep pushing China to change. Like um, as long as they could make money in China, that's sort of like the sad, cynical thing. As long as governments felt like they could get a benefit out of China, then they didn't really care so much about um, the political system. And you know, and then you have people who apologists who just say China is not suited for democracy. So that's, you know, that's where it stands really. Um, and it's funny because now actually we're at this moment where China is really strongly nationalistic again, and Xi Jinping, the current leader, is more like Mao Zedong in some ways, like trying to create his own cult and have it total like centralized power. So in some ways, it's history kind of returning like cyclically. There's more propaganda than ever. Um, less there's less press and less freedom of the press than there was like in under Deng Xiaoping in some ways, and under Deng Xiaoping's successors, you had more. They weren't as totalitarian in some ways. Xi Jinping, the current leader, is really a dictator, and he is really controlling his, taken control pretty authoritatively and changed the constitution so that he can be the leader for life even. But we'll talk more about that for the end of the semester. Did anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Austin?
What is the requirements for the end of the school year presentation?
Oh, so I wanted you guys to do like your own research on a topic that you were interested in. So basically, you'll have a bibliographic report, like an essay, where you'll take like 4 or 5 sources, at least 4. What could be journal articles you find, book chapters, and just present like your findings. So it's more like uh, a report about the research, about the topic. Um, it's not it's not a project of your own where you have to write a report about it, but you're taking some articles and you're kind of learning about in more depth about this topic. And you're summarizing those findings in like an essay, 2 to 3 page essay. So again, you want to have like at least 4 sources. So, and then you kind of summarize by talking about, what the different sources, what are the strengths and weaknesses, or what do you think about, what have you learned in summary from the different perspectives involved. And you don't want to pick a topic that's so huge, like pick a topic that's relatively specific. So and you'll have more, it'll be much easier to do like a report on something that's more specific than, let's say, the Communist Party, the history of the Chinese Communist Party. That's way too big, right? So you want to look at something specific, like maybe propaganda under Mao Zedong, or even something like the model revolutionary operas, or the great propaganda during the Great Leap Forward. You should pick like a specific moment, and look at that. Or if you're interested in looking at a specific writer, you could do a report on the writer, like look at his different stories, short stories, novels, talk about the different aspects of the writer. Does that answer the question? Does that help you or not?
Oh, it does. And I was wondering, can we do one on like a compare and contrast between the economic systems of Mao Zedong, Deng, and the current administration?
I mean, so that's a big topic. That's a lot. That might be beyond the scope of this to do such a large comparison over like, but you could maybe compare. You could do like I would just maybe pick. If you're interested in like economic change, maybe just pick one, like the reform period, like Deng Xiaoping. You don't need to like go back and forth comparing, each one. You can just do a report on one thing, right?
Thank you.
But so I'm gonna like, if you could all by next Thursday have like a topic, um, propose a topic to me, for me, and that way I can like tell you, okay, yeah, that looks good, or I can give you like a little feedback, like that's great. Maybe you want to focus like on this. I can just give you like a suggestion for that. And then I forgot that we have another week of this semester, so we actually have another, after this week we have 3 more weeks. So I think I'm going to push back the essay to be like do the last week of class. Okay.
Okay.
Um, And then I was hoping maybe we could present to the class like a PowerPoint, maybe the last day of class as well. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not assigning you any more papers. Like this is basically just discussion board questions, and then your this final project, and then for the final exam, I haven't really thought about it yet. If I for the final exam, it will be probably covering just what we did since the midterm. So that's all. And again, it would be like short answer questions about the stories we've read. And obviously you can do it at home. You can do like, it can be like an open book test for you. Question, Drew?
Yeah, I just thought of a topic. I wanted to run it by you and see if it was okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I wanted to know if I could do mine on the transition and like settling in of youth in like the provinces in the north and wherever else during the replication movement.
So like the people who actually were sent down there, their experiences,
Or like how they adjusted to like being in a new environment and
yeah, that's a good topic. I mean, because that's very specific. It's about that one movement, like the Russification movement. That's like after the Red Guards are disbanded, and you could find a lot of stuff on that, like articles, uh, memoirs, about that period. If you just do a search like for Chinese youth culture revolution, Russification movement. But yeah, what you'd want to talk about how it's portrayed in literature or what? How it's
I was just gonna I didn't really think of going that deep into it. I was just gonna
yeah.
maybe just talk about like go on JSTOR or some database and see if I could find like a
Yeah.
writer or something that had written
Yeah.
about an
Yeah,
experience they
I
had.
think that's a good way to start. Is just go to like JSTOR and do a search and find some things and just like read a few articles and see what you think. Um, you're obviously can't talk about the whole all 16 million people, so it's good, if you find like a specific province or a specific episode, that's just keep it focused, right?
Did I talk about like that province in the north? I forget what it's called.
Yeah, Heilongjiang. Yeah, you could talk about that, the farmers in the north.
All right.
That's fine. That's basically that's what I'm looking for, something very specific and going a little bit in detail about something very specific. If you're too general, you don't have enough time to be so general, and you can't really delve in any detail.
Right. Okay.
That's why I just want everyone to like tell me what your idea is. And then if I feel like, okay, I could say, you know what, that's great, or great, but let's focus on this topic. Okay?
All right.
Any more questions? So if not, I'm just gonna send you this one like 12-page essay for Thursday, okay? Is that fair, Matthew? Are you there?
I'm
No?
dead.
You're dead? Okay, so you decide. Is that fair? 12-page essay? Okay. And it's a quick read. So I'm going to send that to you right now. I'm going to scan it and send it. Okay, guys?
Oh,
Okay.
and I sent my other email, the Gmail to you in the email, so
Awesome.
appreciate that.
All right, guys. Thanks for the discussion. Try to stay happy and healthy, and I'll see you guys in 48 hours.
See ya.
Bye, Professor.
All right.
Bye.